starting off with explaining the finishing schedule, as we start off by looking exactly what the finishing schedule is. We then look at recognizing the importance of a finishing schedule and how it impacts us as interior designers. Following that with differentiating between a finishing schedule and a sample board, a really interesting topic. And lastly, and most importantly, we end off the lesson by executing the finishing schedule documentation. Before we do get started, here is the quote I have for you for today. Design is in the detail. Focus on the detail, and that will lead you to a well-designed, beautiful space. Now, this quote is not by anyone famous. It's by yours truly. It's one that I stick by with all of my design work. Design is definitely in the detail. And the more you focus on that detail, the more you will come to a well-designed, beautiful space. What are you going to need for today's lesson? So this lesson is totally computer-based. So you're going to definitely need your laptop or computer and then a strong internet connection. And from here, I'm going to show you exactly what programs we're going to be working on. So hold tight as we start off by looking at what we're going to expect. So topic 1, we're going to look at an introduction to finishes. Topic 2, we're going to jump onto the finishing schedule itself. And topic 3, as I said, an exciting one, we are going to create our very own finishing schedule template. We are not going to waste any more time as we dive into our very first topic, an introduction to finishes. So as you know, this lesson is all about our finishing schedule, and in our finishing schedule, or on our finishing schedule, we have our finishes. And that's exactly where we begin. Is anyone able to tell me what a finish is in interior design? How does it relate to us? Think back to Module 1 and Module 2, where we tackled the idea of the finishes on your project. We looked at this in quite a bit of detail. So pop your answers into your Morpheus text box if anyone can tell me what a finish is. Let's tackle the idea of your finishes. Finishes are the elements that are applied to the surface, typically a structural element, that give character and style to a project. They are typically considered as the final surface element to an object or to a surface. A common question on any project: how is the surface or how is the space being finished? Well, it's been finished with either a timber floor, a white wall, charcoal detail on the door handles, and white flush plaster ceilings. That is an example of how we indicate or specify finishes on a project. The finishes on your project are what classify the look and feel within any given space. And these are the elements that we as designers will specify on our projects. So we will typically notate the finishes of a project in a document. One of the very exciting elements to our function and our job as interior designers. The finishes on our project not only have a huge impact on the aesthetics of the space, but they also have an element of protection to them. They can protect the surface that they are applied to from various elements such as water, sunlight, human interaction, extreme cold, corrosion, abrasion, and many other elements. For that reason, there's also a psychological inclusion of thought that needs to be considered when we are specifying or selecting finishes to our spaces or for our projects. Finish selection is truly based on various factors relating to the project. Some of these factors include weather, the client use, goals, and the space location. We are going to look at these elements in a little bit more detail. Let's break up the finish in a little bit more detail. So firstly, generally, when we refer to a finish of a surface, we are generally relating or referring to an internal finish element. But there are times that we can also refer to external finishes. And some of these finishes would be your paint finishes, external lighting fixtures, garage doors, etc. Finishes can be applied to a dry and a wet surface, depending on the instruction for application. Some finishes are also self-finished, meaning that they come complete and finished already, like the surface of a light fitting, for example. Finishes can also be built up of one or two or many more layers. There might be 2 different layers of paint applied in 2 different styles to achieve the final finish. As it is our responsibility on our design project, we need to specify, which means tell the team what we're working with, and describe the finishes that we want to use in our project in as much detail as we possibly can. And this is where our finishes schedule comes into play. Right, so remember about the factors that we discussed that influence our finishes? Well, here are a list of them. The type of finishes that you choose for your project can be influenced by many factors. Some of them including color. What color are we applying to that finish, or what color is that finish? And does that finish harmonize with the rest of the finishes selected in that space? The texture. What texture? How does that finish feel to the touch? The maintenance. Now, this is quite an important one. How do we maintain that finish? Is it easy to maintain? Is it difficult? Does it require certain cleaning products? All these are important to consider when specifying that finish. The durability of that finish. Now, this will influence where you put that finish. So if it's quite a durable finish, you can almost use it anywhere. If it's not durable and weathers quite easily, you want to really be specific where you use it. The longevity. Does it have a long lifespan? Weather. How does weather interact with that finish? For example, a couch that sits with its back to the sun. If the fabric fades quite easily, you're obviously wanting to use a different fabric or move the couch to another location. Does it have a corrosion resistance? And then availability, also incredibly important. This would kind of lead itself or lend itself to projects that are requiring finishes quite rapidly. So, for example, in a retail environment, if you've got 100 stores that need to be out in 1 year, you've got to make sure that that finish is available within that time frame. If it's a once-off project, for example, a domestic installation, so a house, you might get away with a longer lead time. You also want to look at preparation, the ease of application, how easy is it to apply that finish, the drying time, the cost. And obviously, as you know, this is incredibly important. The cost, how much does that finish cost, and how are we going to cost it into our budget? The safety, the waste, and then lastly, our footprint. Now, this is becoming increasingly more important as the years go by. What is that eco footprint on the earth? You may remember these samples from our last lesson. Well, I'm still busy working on them for my hair salon project. My client has approved the vinyl plank as a floor finish. Some of the amazing qualities of this vinyl is that it's durable, it cleans really easy, which is great for high traffic floor finish. It has a luxurious look and feel to it, which is perfect for the location and the type of clientele that we're designing for. And this vinyl floor product has a long lifespan and very little waste, which means it can be removed and reused when and where applicable. And lastly, it has a really easy application process. Do you see how I've used the factors influencing our finish to describe my floor finish? Well, that's important to do on every project with every finish. Consider every element influencing that finish, how it's going to be applied to the space. What is the client's budget? Is there weather that's going to influence that finish? What is the traffic zone? How many people are going to interact with that finish? All very important elements to consider. From here, we move on to an exciting part of the lesson as we look at types of finishes. Lucky for us, there's a large variety of choice as well as a variety of finishes that we have available to us in terms of color, texture, style, and availability. Deciding on what finish we're going to propose is dependent on the various elements, such as the context of the building, the client's goals, requirements, as well as the brief. It can be incredibly daunting to think that you need to specify every single finish on every part of your project. Well, it was for me on my very first project. There are so many things that one needs to think about and consider when specifying the finish. But lucky for you, I've put a checklist together, a very general one, of the main areas to consider when specifying finishes on any project. These finishes are frequently used by interior designers. So my theory in this concept is to start with the ground level and work your way upwards. So think about everything to do with the ground level, following that with your walls, and then your ceiling. So let's take a look. Firstly, I start by specifying everything to do with my floor finishes. What floor finish is in the project? Am I using tiling, carpeting, timber, stone, concrete, rubber, mosaic, vinyl, cork, etc.? What is my floor finish? From here, I take a look at the wall finishes. What have I applied to the walls? This is a general application. So is it plastering? Is it tiled? Have I applied a wallpaper, painting, moldings, architraves, etc.? In this section, I would typically include skirting because obviously my skirting would be applied to the wall. From here, I look at what door finishes and window finishes look like. What is my door finish? Is it a timber frame? Is it a steel frame or a UPVC frame? And then what type of glass have I used? Have we used double glazed glass, single glazed glass, etc.? Following this, I look at all of the electrical finishes. I bet you've never thought about this one. What does the lighting fixture look like? What does the cover plate on the electrical point look like? What color is it? What texture is it, etc.? I include all of this in the detail. From here, I move on to the joinery. So this could be elements like your cabinets and countertops. Finishes here, you could think about stone, engineered stone, timber, formica, post-form tops, rubber tops, cork, glass, tile, etc. You'd also look at what splashbacks have been used, so this would be relevant in your kitchen and your bathrooms. Next, you want to look at your window treatment. So what has been applied to the window? Have you applied curtains or blinds or shutters? And then some of the materials associated with this would be fabric, timber, polyprop, metal, cork, etc. After my window treatments, I migrate to the furniture, and this could be anything from couches to tables, linens, bedding, etc. Some of the finishes that you might want to consider here are what fabrics have been used, what metals, has there been glass used, or timber. And then lastly, I finish off my specification schedule, my finishing schedule checklist, looking at the ceiling finishes. So this could be anything to do with electrics that have been applied to the ceiling, as well as the actual finish of that ceiling. Some of the materials that you want to consider are plasterboard, coves, moldings, steel, lattice. Has the ceiling been plastered? Does it have a board applied to it? Has there been linings indicated in the ceiling? Have we used ceiling tiles, timber cladding, etc.? As you can see, there are a variety of finishes associated with each category, but by categorizing these finishes as I have done, flooring, walls, doors, etc., it makes it a lot more easier to collate all of that information. Now that we know where and what we need to specify, we're going to take a look at where we are in the project timeline and where we need to start specifying the finishes for our project. So why are we looking at the finishes now? Well, we've just presented our sample boards to the client and they love what we've proposed for the hair salon space. And guess what? They've decided to proceed to the next step. They want to start the construction documentation phase. Think back to our timeline. Do you know where we are in the project design timeline? We are at the construction documentation phase. That means that we have already obtained our brief, generated the schematic drawings, and conceptualized the project. All of our drawings, mood boards, concept boards, design brief, and project proposal documentation have been approved by our client. Very important. Our next step here is to prepare for construction and manufacture. So how do we actually go about doing that? We start our construction documentation. Our responsibility as a designer on any project is to generate construction documentation. A portion of this stage is to finalize the finishes that we're going to be implementing to our project. The finishes that we select and add to our sample board. Do you notice the word change here? We have now moved from project proposal to project implementation. This is a turning point for the designer on any given project. It means that the client has decided to proceed with your ideas, your concepts, and the proposals. So well done. You've managed to convince the client that your idea is going to assist in achieving a well-designed space and achieve all the goals set out to you by your client. An achievement for any designer. With that being said, let's take a look at our second topic for today's lesson. When we allocate a finish to a project, we need to describe in as much detail as we can what finish we're supplying. We do this in the format of our construction documentation. With the idea that we need to set up some form of documentation for the contracting teams to work from as we begin construction, we are going to look at that documentation in more detail as we move to an interesting topic, the finishing schedule. We start off by asking ourselves, what is the finishing schedule? So if any of you can tell me what the finishing schedule is, pop your answers into your Morpheus text box, or simply make a note for yourselves in your sketchbooks. Remember, this is the last lesson of Module 3, and you're looking at your final module assignment, so do be prepared. What is the finishing schedule? In simple terms, the finishing schedule is a schedule or document holding all of the information about the finishes that we've selected for our project. The finishing schedule will contain all of the information about the finishes broken down throughout the project. So as I showed you, some of the topics or headings that we looked at were your floor finishes, wall finishes, and ceiling finishes. It'll contain the material detail about those walls, floors, and doors, etc. This schedule is going to contain the information and detail relevant to each section. So it's going to detail up the material, the finish, and the texture, as well as any other information relevant to the finish. A typical finishing schedule can range from a very simple document listing specific finishes for smaller elements right through to an incredibly complex document, depending on the size and complexity of your project. For example, you might be working on a renovation on a simple kitchen space, so your finishing schedule would only apply to the elements within that space that you're working on. Whereas if you're working on a large corporate building, it may have a variety of rooms and spaces within that project, which are more complex and in-depth analysis of finishes would apply. The reason interior designers and architects create finishing schedules is to communicate critical product information to the contracting and construction teams to enable them to build and carry out the project from start to finish. A really cool way to think about it is like this. The finishing schedule is like the recipe book to your project. It's the guideline of how, where, and what is going to be included during construction. Let's take a look at an example. Firstly, we have the material. So the flour, in our case, the paint. Then we have quantity. So how much of that sample or product is being applied. So when it comes to a cake, let's say we've got 3 cups of flour. In our case, we might need 3 liters of paint to paint a wall. You might need 70 square meters of tile or 5 square feet of tiles. Then we need to look at the location. Where is the material being applied? So in the case of a recipe, we would be putting our flour into a preparation bowl. If we were applying paint, we would be applying paint to a living room wall. So you need to specify the location of where that finish is going to be applied. And lastly, you need to indicate the method. How are you going to add the product or finish? So in the case of a recipe, you want to sieve the flour into a bowl. In our case, you might want to paint the 3 coats onto the living room wall. You need to tell the contracting team as well as the client how exactly you're going to add the finishes to the given space. So this is essentially your recipe for when specifying the finish into the space. You need to tell the client or contracting team the material that you're going to use, the quantity of that material, where the material is going to be implemented to the location, and then the method of implementation. Why do you think the finishing schedule is so important? Think about what information we're going to add to the document, as well as the people that are going to be using this document, and then tell me why you think it's such an important document. Again, pop your answers into your Morpheus text box or make a note for yourselves in your sketchbooks. Think about how we use the finishing schedule on our projects. Here is why. Firstly, the finishing schedule assists us in cost generation or development. Construction teams will use your finishing schedule to estimate costs and quantities of the required material on any given project. Secondly, your finishing schedule is like a consolidated checklist of everything that's going to take place on the project. This document is the central location where all the specifications and finishes are documented. When looking for anything relating to your finishes of your project, anyone working on the project would simply need to navigate to your finishing schedule document to be able to access this information at any given point. I often like to have a printed finishing schedule on my project on site so that with any questions anyone has, they can navigate to this document. So it's on site, it's a physical document, as well as an emailed version has been sent out to all of the contracting teams. Thirdly, it highlights the project's look and feel. Most importantly, this document is the Bible of every finish that could possibly be used on your project. It's a place of record per se, where all of the finishes are placed in one location, showing exactly what can be expected on your project finishes list. This is not only essential from a client point of view to know exactly what can be expected on your project, but also essential for the contracting teams to access and assess what goes where and how each element fits together. And lastly, it's important for historic reference. If you ever need to go back to advise a client what color the floor that they used was, or to find out who the supplier was and when it was or where it was installed, you are able to find all of the information on the project specification schedule, or otherwise known as the finishing schedule. You can flip through this document at any point at any time and advise anyone needing questions answered. Remember, our finishing schedule is about conveying a message about what finishes are being implemented into our projects. See, I've used that word again. We're implementing, not proposing. We're in the big leagues now. The finishing schedule is vital to a variety of people on your project. So let's take a look at who they are and what this document does for them, starting off with the procurement team. This team or person is responsible for the purchasing of the finishes. This could be the designer, the client, or a project procurement team. They need to know exactly what they're purchasing. They need to know vital information such as how much they need to procure, where they are purchasing the product from, and any other important details such as shipping methods, where the product is being purchased from and for, so the location and the address, and then definitely an important one, lead times. How long is that stock going to take to be able to be purchased and brought to site? Then we have the construction team. The construction team needs to know how much of the product is being ordered, to know how much of the product they can actually work with. They need to know the sizes of each of the finishes, furniture elements. They also need to know how much product is going to be installed. Are there any special instructions about how the product works and how it needs to be stored or installed, so the application method? Then the finishing schedule is important for the manufacturing team. The joiner or the manufacturer needs to know elements such as size, quantity, fixing procedure, color, and texture. Then we have the supplier. Never forget about the supplier. The supplier is going to use your finishing schedule to procure and produce accurate invoices and place orders for the products based on the quantities that you are providing on the schedule. They need to know what colors, finishes, samples, sizes, and quantities you're needing for your specific project. Based on this information, they will put the invoice together and send it to you or your client for approval. The next team of people or persons involved are the marketing and sales team. This may be a section that you've never thought about. This document is vital to the sale of a new development, a development that is off-plan or a spec build. The sales agent needs to sell the house to the interested new homeowner, and they will need to provide them a list of expected finishes for them to approve or sign off on the build and purchase. All of this information is going to be found on that one document, the finishing schedule or your specification schedule. So as you can see, this schedule provides vital information to everyone involved on the project, and it needs to include very specific information, right from where the product is being sourced from, what the project looks like and how it feels like, where the product is going to be installed, how it's going to be installed, and the quantity that we're ordering in at. As you can see, this document is put in place for one very specific reason: to provide information to the various teams of people working on your project. For that reason, this document forms a part of a contract per se, and therefore needs to be 100% accurate, 100% precise, and 100% approved by the client. On your screen is an example of a finishing schedule that I have created for a recent development. This finishing schedule is then sent out to the client for signature. Take a look and see how detailed this schedule is. Take a look at the various forms and headings of information that I've included. Exciting, right? Amazing. So from here, we're going to look at what to include on your finishing schedule. On the understanding that this document is an information-based document that relays information to the contractors, clients, suppliers, and manufacturers, what information do you think needs to be included and incorporated onto this document in order for us to successfully achieve the primary purpose or function of the document? Think about who is using this document. Think about why you are putting the document together and why it's so important before you answer this question. You can pop your answers into Morpheus or make a note for yourselves in your sketchbooks. Why is this an important document? Right, so here is a list of information to focus on in your finishing schedule. Some of the headings that you want to include. Firstly, the material. What material is the finish? What is the size of the finish? So for example, you might have a floor tile that's 600 millimeters by 600 millimeters. Each tile is 600 by 600. You might have a floor plank that is 1.2 meters long by 250 millimeters wide by 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters thick. All that information about the size of the finish needs to be included. From here, you want to include elements such as finish, color, and texture. So again, back to our floor tile. Maybe the finish of our floor tile is a sheen finish or a matte finish. The color might be gray, and our texture might be rough. That all needs to be included. Then we need to include the code. So this specifically relates to the manufacturer and the supplier. What code have they given out for that finish so that our procurement team can accurately procure that finish or material? The quantity. How much of that finish do we need to order for our project? The supplier. Who are we ordering that finish from? Then we have the location. Where is that finish going to be installed on our projects? And then I always like to include an image of that finish. So this is the area and the headings that I would typically add to my finishing schedule. These are the elements that need to be specified and highlighted on our finishing schedule. Let's see if you're all following as we try an example for a second. Grab your sketchbooks and let us create a rough finishing schedule. You're going to use this room on your screen as an example, and we're going to break it up into 3 main headings as we look at the finish relating to those headings. You are going to then populate those headings with finishes associated to the image. We're going to start off from the bottom and work our way up, starting with the floor. So when it comes to the floor finish, you want to look at what the material is, the size of the material, and then specify exactly what that finish looks like. In my case at home, the material of my floor is a tile. The size of that tile is 600 by 600 millimeters, and then the finish of that tile is a gray, rough, textured 600 by 600 tile. I'm then going to complete this specification by adding a little bit more detail, explaining that it is fixed directly to the concrete slab and that I'd like a dove gray grout color to sit in between the tile. So remember, the more information you give, the better. I might even add the supplier's details here depending on the contract that I have with the client and who is physically purchasing these finishes. So in the case of the image on your screen, the example on your screen, the material that we're looking at is a carpet. So the floor finish is a carpeted material. It's a gray carpet from what I can see. The size of this carpet, so now this is a bit of a tricky one. It's a roll-on carpet from what I can see. So it's not a tile-on carpet. So what you do here is you'd measure out the size of the space and give that size as the size of the material required. And that would then also lead into the quantity needed. And then for the finish, we need to explain what carpet it is. It's a rough textured carpet, it looks to me. It's a gray colored carpet and it might have some black flecks in it. Obviously, we'd need to see the sample close up to provide this detail. And then I would also go to the supplier and ask the supplier for an exact specification for this carpet and use this on my finishing schedule. Right, next we're going to tackle the walls. And here the same tactic applies. We're going to specify the material, the size, and the finish. So in the example on your screen, we can see that the basic wall color looks like an off-white. So it's very difficult to give the detail from an image on your screen. I would typically go to the paint specification schedule, so the paint finish that you can get from your local hardware or handyman, and recite that directly into your finishing schedule. But for the purposes of this exercise, I'm going to give you an idea of what paint color I've got on my walls, which is pretty similar to the one in the picture. So the one on my wall, the material is a paint finish. The size, again, we're going to specify the size of the wall, so how many square meters we're looking at. And then the finish. So in my case, it's a Plascon Mandarin Tusk, and then I'm going to specify the code, so a 60cc code, and then any other detail relating to that wall. So it's a wash and wear Vlkolínec. Then we migrate to the ceiling. Remember, and as you can see by the example, I'm working from the ground upwards, and that's just a process flow that I work with. You can work with anyone. It just makes a lot more sense to me, and it assists me when generating my finish selection. So on our ceiling here, this is a very standard office ceiling. The material is a 1200 by 600 ceiling board, so that's our material. The size, again, the actual board is 600 by 1200 millimeters. However, I would also then measure the size of that ceiling. So how many square meters or square feet is that ceiling? And then the finish, and that I would get directly from my supplier and put that into my finishing schedule. And there you have it. That is typically how we would break up a specification schedule for a room. From here, we're going to move on to the tools of the trade. We now have a solid understanding about what our finishing schedule is and how it assists us or aids us in our project. I'm sure the next question on your mind is, how do we put this schedule together? Well, right you are. We're going to take a look at the tools that we can use to set up our finishing schedule. As you know, and as you're well aware, there are so many programs out there that help us in doing various functions within the design process. But for the purposes of today's lesson, I'm going to show you some of my tried and tested tools that you can use to set up your finishing schedule. Starting off with an amazing program, Microsoft Excel. I'm sure most of you are aware of what Excel does and how it looks like, but for those of you who don't, it's probably the most accessible and easy to use tool for this process, as it already has a table format set up for you. Excel allows us to customize the table, change it up, and populate the headings with so much ease. You are even able to add images to your information, which is a bonus for this process. Then we've got PowerPoint. So PowerPoint is typically more a pictorial display of setting up your finishing schedule. Instead of a table format, you would add your images and break them down room by room, section by section in a collage type format. This format is possibly more creative and easier to set up as there's no structure, and it would form more of a mood board setup. However, I do find this can become a little bit less organized and more complex on PowerPoint. From here, we can use Word or a free template. So let me explain this. There is obviously Microsoft Word, where you can set up a very unstructured finishing schedule with headings and text next to it. Otherwise, you can go onto Google and Google a free finishing schedule template. You'll see a whole lot pop up that you can download and then import into Word and use them like that. All in all, my preference is Excel. I like using Excel. However, I've added a link to your summary notes for some free finishing schedule templates that you can use that I've come across throughout my research. Otherwise, if you're not going to use that, no stress. I'm going to show you exactly how to set up your very own finishing schedule template. As we start to look at the components to the finishing schedule. A finishing schedule, as we know, has many elements and components to it. So those would be your headings. We're going to look at how these headings and components can be broken down as we look at some of the vital information to include on your schedule. Some notes here. There are various ways of putting a finishing schedule together. The one that I'm going to show you is my tried and tested version and the way that suits me best, and you're welcome to use this and change it up to suit your project needs. I'm going to start off by showing you a list of headings that you can use on any finishing schedule. So I don't use all of them, I pick some of them, and then obviously underneath these headings, we populate the information. One of the first headings I use is a tag or code. So remember, we're specifying a sample or a finish that needs to go on a surface. So you want to supply the tag or code that you get from the supplier so you know exactly which element you're specifying. Then you want to add an image. Now this is really important. Make sure that you're adding the correct image for that product. You then want to add the product name, as well as a product description explaining everything to do with that product, what it looks like, the size, the shape, etc. You want to then specify how much needs to be ordered, the quantity to order of that product. You can then add a product code, an installation location, who the manufacturer is, so who's manufacturing that product, how the product needs to be installed, and then any additional notes that you have not included under these headings. Remember, these are the headings to your specification schedule, and the information will be populated below. Right, so have a look on your screen on the right-hand side. This is an example of a finishing schedule, and I'm assuming it's been created on Word, not Excel. But just to give you an idea, this is how one would set up a typical finishing schedule. The heading above of the finishing schedule, so as you can see, building standards and conditions, that is the heading to the finishing schedule. And underneath, there's a blurb of information describing how the building standards and conditions need to look like. And then the same below, foundations and surface beds. Underneath that, there's a description. So as you can see, there's a heading and a description relating to that heading for the finishes. On your screen is an example of how I put my headings into my finishing schedule. So as you can see, I haven't used all of them. I've only used the ones specific to my project. So I've gone with image, code, the specification, the quantity, the supplier or manufacturer, the link to the site of the product. So a lot of my products can be found online, the price, and then any notes relating to that. Remember, guys, these are the headings for the finishes. So each finish will need to be detailed separately below. So for example, let's start with your flooring. Maybe you've got a floor tile and a carpet. Under the image, you'd put a floor tile, and then underneath that, you would do a separate line for your carpet. When setting up my schedule, I like to break up my schedule into categories based on where the finish is located on my project. For example, floor finishes, wall finishes, joinery, ceiling, and lighting, as I've showed you before. So each of these sections would have a separate finishing schedule page to it. I don't like to have all of it on one document or one page, as I find it becomes awfully cluttered and claustrophobic. However, other designers may choose to categorize their schedules by location. For example, having a schedule categorized bedroom, bathroom, kitchen, and dining. There is no right or wrong manner. I find, however, that by breaking the finishes up into grouped categories by finish, it makes it much easier to find. So in summary, you can categorize your schedule either by material type or the location of installation, so room by room. Let's have a look at how that's done. So this is my finishing or specification schedule on your screen. And as you can see at the bottom on the tabs, I've got a variety of different tabs. Now that is how I've broken my finishing schedule up. I've got sanitary ware, floor finishes, wall finishes and paint, and joinery, and then each of the headings relating to that below. We now have a solid understanding of what a finishing schedule is and what a finish is and how it gets added to that finishing schedule. From here, we're going to look at how to set up a finishing schedule step by step. We're going to start off by looking at the project scenario and how I've gone about setting up my finishing schedule from here on out. Based on the understanding that this document is information-based and relays information to the contractor, client, suppliers, and manufacturer, what information do you think needs to be included? Think about who is using the document. Think about why you're producing this document and why it's important before you answer the question. Pop your answers into Morpheus. I'm going to start you off by showing you my process flow for creating a specification or finishing schedule. So firstly, I start off by gathering my information and images. I then set up my template, and like I told you before, the tool and the primary tool I use for this is Excel. And then from there, I populate the document. I populate the headings on my template. Let's break that up as we start off by showing you what step 1 looks like. As you know, step 1 is all about gathering the information. So I generally start off by organizing and gathering all of the information about my finishes relating to my entire project. This should be relatively easy as we've just done a very similar task for our sample board. So I'm going to make sure that I've got all of that information in one folder on my desktop or in my project folder, as this will speed up the process when I start to populate the information into my schedule. If you're unsure about where to find this information, please do a refresh from your Lesson 7, Module 3. However, generally, most of this information can be found online. Alternatively, you need to contact your supplier via email or telephone, or even better, go into the store and ask them any questions you need information on. Often, you may also find that the sample that the supplier has provided you with has all of the details on the back of the sample or in a brochure that they've provided you with. So be sure to check everything out. So this is my planning phase. I go online and I make sure that I've got all the information relevant to my sample. Let's, for instance, say I'm specifying the floor tile. I go onto the floor tile from the supplier that I'm wanting to purchase it from, or from the supplier that I've seen the tile from. I make sure I navigate to the correct location. So I'm going to go for a wood look tile. Select that. Navigate to the correct tile. So I'm going to go for the Hout Bay Beige Matte Ceramic Floor Tile. Once I've clicked on that, all of the information I need for my finishing schedule is here. The size, the product detail, everything. So I can then use this information to populate my finishing schedule, but for now I'm going to save it somewhere because remember, we're gathering the information. So I'm copying the image and I'm going to save it into my folder. Remember that folder we looked at last lesson? Well, I've created another one called Specification Schedule Details. And then I'm adding it into my supplier information section. From here, I move on to step 2. And step 2 was all about setting up my template. This is where I'm going to add the headings into my Excel document and set up the template so it's much easier populating it when I get to my step 3. I generally use a template as a schedule that I've set up before and then alter the headings accordingly. You can do the same once you've got your formalized template set up. So you can copy mine or use one that you've downloaded from the internet. Right, so this is my template, or this is one that I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to start off by giving a name of the finish that we are going to be specifying. So are we breaking it room by room? So it would be bathroom finishes. Or are we breaking it up finish by finish? So I like to, as you know, break it up finish by finish. So I'm going to start my template with sanitary ware. This is just a template, like I said. You can give whatever starting point that you want to. Like I said, I'm starting with sanitary ware. And then from here, I'm going to set up the template and add headings. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, if you tab along to the right, I've broken down my template into the finishes. Doors and windows, floor finishes, and sanitary ware. Anything that is relevant to my project, I've broken it down into little tabs at the bottom. Right, so as you can see, this is how I've populated my headings. My headings include image, code, specification, quantity, supplier or manufacturer, a link to the site where you can find the product, the price, and then any additional notes. I make sure that these headings are all neat and tidy in the same font. Remember, all of our documentation needs to be neat, tidy, and precise. I make sure that I've got the correct borders around my document. So I'm spending a little bit of time on this because remember, you're going to have people looking at this and working from this document. So it needs to be an incredibly professional and well set out document. So guys, just a handy tip and something that I'm going to encourage you all to add to any of your specification schedules is a notes section at the bottom that applies to the whole document. And in these notes, I add any restrictions or elements that I want the client to be aware of when signing this document off. Plus, I add a signature section at the bottom so the client can actually sign in their approval. So some of the notes that I'm adding on in here, and because it's specifically relating to sanitary ware, one of the notes is that black sanitary ware may peel. This is allowing the client to acknowledge that the sanitary ware is not produced by me and I do not take responsibility for that. I've also indicated that the client needs to approve all quotations and finishes prior to any orders being placed. The quote needs to be approved by the client, and all measurements need to be taken on site prior to any orders being made. Guys, this information is vital when it comes to signing off this document. It safeguards you as the designer against any mishaps that may happen on the project. You can include or add any additional notes that you see fit. Right, so once I've got my schedule set up, this is my template and the starting point for my finishing schedule. I'm going to create similar tabs using this one. This is the main template. So I'm going to right click, select the template I want to copy, make sure I tick create a copy, and there you have it. There's your copy. From here, I'm going to give the next tab a name. So let's say I'm going to create floor finishes as the next one and move that along my tab list as I want to see it. As you can see, I've got a couple here lined up already. That's just to show you exactly how to do it. And I'm going to create my furniture schedule. I'm going to change the name so that I've got a furniture schedule. From here, moving on to step 3, as we look at how to populate the headings on my template. When we speak about populating the headings, this simply means to allocate the correct information to the relevant heading relating to each product or specification and sample. This is to ensure that the finish has sufficient information to it. For example, under flooring, you want to make sure that you have allocated all the flooring elements to the flooring finish. You need to provide the information such as the material tag, the product image, the name, the description, the quantity of that product, the code, the location where it's going to be allocated to your project, the manufacturer's information, a contact person, so the supplier, and then the installation method. Let's take a look at how it's done as I show you how I've populated mine. So as you can see in the first line, I've started off with the bath. Remember, I'm in my sanitary ware specification tab. So I'm allocating every element of sanitary ware in this document on this tab. I started with my image. I then added the code. Then I added the specification. I'm then adding a location, so where it's going to sit on my project, the quantity that I'm ordering, the supplier's information. This is an interesting one. The link to where you can find it online. So all of the information online. I'm then adding the price. And then a column for any notes. I'm adding any notes relevant to this bath. Right, so let me show you how it's done. I start off by navigating to my folder where I've gathered all my information. I get my image. I copy that across to my Excel document and then paste it there under images. Remember guys, because this is a professional document, I'm going to make sure that all of the images and information I'm adding are neat, clean, and precise. Right, now I'm going to add the code. Don't know where the code comes from. Well, that comes from all the information that you gathered from the website or from the supplier. So in this case, the code is ZA1010. From here, I'm going to add the specification. So I have worked with this product. I know what the specification is. If you don't know, you need to go back to the supplier or navigate to the website where you're getting the product from and then add that information right there. So you can simply cut and copy right into this block. Next, I'm going to add the location. So this basin is allocated or located in all the bathrooms in my project. Then I'm adding the quantity. There are 3 basins. The supplier, I'm getting the basin from a company called CTM. I'm now going to add the link. So I navigate to the website, get the link, and I'm going to cut and copy that link under the heading where it says link. So I'm populating the information into the link section. From here, I'm adding the price. And then in the notes section, any additional notes that relate to this basin. So I'm going to just simply state that it excludes the taps and waste elements so the client knows exactly what they're getting. Remember, guys, you need to do this exercise for any of the products on your project. So as you can see, this is one that I've created for a different client. I've populated everything to do with the sanitary ware in the sanitary section. You'll then repeat that for every tab going forward. As you can see, I've also included my notes section, allocating any notes relating to the general project, and then I'm going to encourage my client to sign in approval. Right, so once you've completed your finishing or specification schedule, you're then going to need to present that document to your client for signature. Remember, guys, everything needs to be signed and verified by the client. So this is how you would go about doing that. Firstly, you would set up a meeting with your client, prepare all the components, and then conduct the meeting. In that meeting, you would take your specification schedule and document with you, sit down with the client, go through each of the elements. This is very important. Make sure that the client knows exactly what you've specified and make sure that they understand the specification schedule. Go through each element, each heading, each populated information section. Make sure that they sign at the bottom of each page. And then from that, you can scan that document in and send it to the client via email. And that's a wrap for today's lesson, the end of Module 3, the end of Lesson 8. Let's do a quick recap of what we've covered. We started off by explaining the finishing schedule. We looked at the importance of the finishing schedule when it comes to us as interior designers. We differentiated between a finishing schedule and a sample board. We executed the finishing schedule by creating our very own finishing schedule template. Well done, guys, an amazing lesson and definitely one of my favorites.